Hello.
Hi.
Can you hear us all right?
Pardon?
Can you hear us fine?
I can hear you now, yeah.
That's
Are
fantastic.
we ready to get started?
Yeah, we are when you are. Yeah, thanks
Okay.
very much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks.
We've got some questions from sort of a broad range of students, a sort of broad spectrum of questions on different things. But we're going to try and ask as many as possible in the sort of time frame that we have. So if we get started. Yeah, what does the election of Benjamin Netanyahu mean for the prospect of peace and a Palestinian state?
Well, there's a bit of confusion about that matter. Actually, Benjamin Netanyahu's administration, first administration in 1996, is the first one that he was even willing to pronounce the words Palestinian state. When Shimon Peres, who's considered a dove, left office in 1996, his parting words, very outspoken, were that there will never be a Palestinian state. When Netanyahu came in, his Minister of Information was asked by the press whether they would continue that policy of total rejectionism, which had been the U.S.-Israeli position without a break. And the minister said, well, we're planning to leave certain fragments of territory to the Palestinians, and if they like, they can call it a state, or they can call it fried chicken. That was the first acknowledgement of a state. The Labor Party basically never acknowledged the possibility. But the question always is, what do you mean by a state? Do you mean fried chicken, or do you mean what's been meant by the very broad international consensus that the U.S. and Israel have blocked for over 30 years? That first entered the international agenda in 1976 when the Arab states, with support of the PLO, brought a resolution to the Security Council calling for a settlement on the international border, the Green Line, in accord with UN 242, main document, but added to 242 that there should be a Palestinian state in the Israeli-occupied territories. Well, Israel refused to attend the session. The United States vetoed the resolution. It happened again in 1980. I won't run through the history. I'll just take a crucial point. In 1988, the Palestinian National Council, the highest body, formally accepted the two-state settlement of the international consensus. And the U.S. and Israel reacted. A few months later, the coalition government of Israel, that's Shimon Peres and Yitzhak Shamir, issued a declaration saying, their words, there can be no additional Palestinian state between Jordan and Israel, meaning we declare Jordan to be a Palestinian state and there can't be another one. And the U.S. backed that. It's the Baker Plan of December 1989, said, yes, we fully accept the Israeli position. And so it continues up until the present. There's been one exception in the last 35 years, that in January 2001, it's the end of Clinton's term. At the end of Clinton's term, he issued what he called his parameters for a settlement, kind of vague, but more or less in accord with the international consensus. And then he gave a speech in which he said both sides have accepted the parameters, both sides have reservations. They met, top negotiators of Israel and Palestine met in Taba, Egypt in January to iron out the reservations, and they came very close to a settlement. In their last press conference, they said, with a few more days, we'll be finished. And there's a lot known about it. There's a lot of material in Hebrew and in English as well, so we know the details of it. But it was called off prematurely by Prime Minister Barak of Israel, and there's been no formal continuation since. So when you talk a bit, right now the issues between Israel and the United States are two things. Will Netanyahu pronounce the word state? And what will happen with the settlements? And it really doesn't matter whether Netanyahu or Obama or Bush or anyone else pronounces the word state. They have to say what they mean. Is it going to be the international consensus, or is it going to be fried chicken? And on that, they're suitably vague. In fact, not quite vague, because the U.S. has now endorsed the major annexation proposals of Israel in the West Bank, which everyone agrees across the board are illegal. Can't move in violation of the Geneva Conventions. In fact, Israel was informed of that by its highest legal authorities in 1967, and confirmed. It's been confirmed by Security Council, the World Court, and so on. So, but the Bush administration did authorize Israel to take over unspecified areas of the West Bank and annex them. We know what it means. I mean, Prime Minister Olmert described it to the Congress, joint session of Congress, called his convergence plan. In effect, it means that Israel takes over everything within what ought to be called the annexation wall. It's called a separation fence. Actually, an annexation wall takes over everything there, which is critically important. That means not only the nice suburbs of Jerusalem and Tel Aviv up in the hills, it means greater Jerusalem, which is vastly expanded over Jerusalem. And critically, it means taking over the aquifer, the water supplies. Israel now uses about, I think, 4/5 of them, according to a recent World Bank report. They're in the West Bank, but Israel uses them. And if they annex that in accord with the U.S. position, they get control of the water supplies. Also, the Jordan Valley, from which Palestinians are increasingly excluded, which imprisons what's left, and a couple of salients that run through the whole region, basically breaking it up into cantons. Now, if that's what you mean by a state, what's left, it's fried chicken. It's not a state. And Obama has indicated, hasn't said, but he's indicated that that's what he means. He's very evasive, but the clearest position that he's expressed was in his one declaration about Israel-Palestine, when he appointed George Mitchell, gave a talk at the State Department, and he went out of his way to welcome the Arab League proposal, 2002 Saudi proposal accepted by the Arab League, which was in accord with the international consensus, called for a two-state settlement on the international border, maybe with minor and mutual modifications. It's the terminology that was used back in the late 60s, U.S. terminology. And then the Saudi plan added that in the context of that settlement, the Arab states should move towards normalization of relations with Israel. Now, if you read Obama's statement carefully, he welcomed the Arab League plan. He said it was very constructive, and the Arab states should move forward right away with normalization of relations with Israel. But he knows he understands. He can think things through, and what he omitted is critical. He did not include the core of their resolution. He just said, go ahead with the corollary, proceed to normalize. But he knows perfectly well that was not the proposal. And that can only be understood as an indirect way of saying that the U.S. continues to reject the core of the consensus on a two-state settlement. So what he's talking about apparently is fried chicken. Hasn't made it explicit. With regard to the so that means if there is a settlement, a political settlement in these terms, it means that Israel essentially takes over what Olmert described, Prime Minister Olmert, a couple of years ago as the convergence plan, what I just outlined, and that essentially leaves nothing. There will be areas, but totally unviable. There's an extra part of this which is even worse. There was a proposal from the extreme right in Israel. Avigdor Lieberman, now foreign minister. When it was proposed, it was considered virtually neo-Nazi, to take parts of Israel that are on the Green Line, right on the border, but are heavily populated by Arabs. That's up in the Galilee. It's called the Wadi Ara area, and just forcefully transferred into some kind of derisory Palestinian state. Of course, the people are strongly opposed, but nobody asks them. That, at the time, was a far-right proposal. It's now in the center. Tzipi Livni, the so-called of opposition, has accepted it. The New York Times has accepted it. It says, it's very forthcoming. Israel will yield land. So a likely outcome is that the U.S. and Israel will agree to what they'll call a land swap, meaning Israel will take anything it wants, anything of value, and the Arab citizens of Israel that are concentrated in that area will be forcibly transferred against their will into some derisory Palestinian entity, which they can call a state or fried chicken. And that'll be welcomed in the West. I think you can predict that. In fact, as I say, it's already been welcomed by the New York Times. So that's a possible outcome. Now, what about settlements, the other big issue? Hillary Clinton did make a strong statement the other day, stronger than usual, in which she said, we oppose any expansion of settlements that includes new settlements, includes outposts, includes natural growth. Now, natural growth has been the traditional term for expanding the settlement areas. Actually, most of the growth is from immigrants from Israel, but what it's called natural growth. She said, no, none of that. And Israel rejected that. No, we say we have to permit natural growth. We can't prevent people from adding, building a new house in their settlements that we intend to keep and so on. Actually, what you said was not that new. It's quoted from the famous roadmap. The roadmap was presented by a couple of years ago, international, with the U.S. Initiating it, which laid out a series of steps towards political settlement. And among the steps was an end to settlement, including natural growth. So Clinton was, in fact, reiterating what's in the roadmap, which the U.S. had never lived up to, and Israel incidentally had instantly rejected with 14 reservations, which eliminated most of the content. So Clinton did reiterate the wording of the roadmap, which is described in the press as a kind of a novel, strong position. But the question, as always, is will the U.S. do anything about it? I mean, they formulated it when the roadmap was produced and repeatedly in the past, and Israel's essentially ignored it. And the U.S. has funded Israel's ignoring of it. I mean, if the U.S. wanted to block further natural growth, it's easy to do, just to withdraw funding. Withdraw funding, in fact, maybe all funding, or at least any funding going into the settlements, all of which are illegal anyway. But even if Israel agreed to this position and lived up to it for the first time, that would still leave the entire settlement project in place. Annexation of the valuable areas, taking over the Jordan Valley, the salients that are cutting through it, Greater Jerusalem, which is where most of the construction is going on now. None of that's even being discussed. So there is a kind of a conflict, but it's not clear that it's any more than terminological.
Okay, thank you.
Here at Sussex, there has been much discussion of boycotting Israeli goods. There has also been talk of an academic boycott. You have expressed objections to this matter. Could you clarify these and perhaps expand on them?
Well, personally, I've never been in favor of academic boycotts, even in the case of South Africa. I don't think it's a good idea. Israeli goods, yeah, I think there are forms of what's called BDS, boycott, divestment, sanctions. There are forms of BDS which I think make good sense. So, for example, a couple of years ago in England, maybe it's still going on, there was an effort to divest from Caterpillar Corporation. Okay, that makes good sense. Caterpillar constructs what amount to weapons of mass destruction. It's these huge, monstrous Caterpillar bulldozers that Israel uses to, turn the land into desert, in effect, to destroy towns, villages, olive groves, even kill people and so on. So yeah, there's no reason why anybody should tolerate, and it's all illegal. It's all criminal activity in occupied territories. So it makes good sense to boycott, divest from Caterpillar or any corporate, British or American, which is providing arms. In fact, at least by American law, that's illegal. They all do it. So boycotting anybody who's involved in the occupation, I think, makes perfect sense. In fact, at least in the U.S., it accords with the U.S. On the other hand, boycotting goods it might make some sense, but why Israel? I mean, the core of the problems in the United States. As long as the U.S. Provides the decisive military, economic, diplomatic, even ideological support for all of this, that's where the problem is. The U.S. has essentially blocked a political settlement for 35 years, with the single exception of that 1 week in Taba. So the right move should be to boycott U.S. goods. Well, nobody's going to do that because you don't irritate the Godfather. Maybe you can go after the Godfather's clients, but not the Godfather. He's immune, so it's not raised. And of course, it would be economically impossible anyway. Too much integration. But that fact, and this extends to a lot of the. I mean, you could say the same about U.S. academic institutions, and they're involved in a lot of things that are much worse than their crucial role in the Israeli occupation. I don't have to run through them. So there is a kind of a sense of hypocrisy behind the BDS movement because of this fact, unless it explicitly targets the institutions and corporations that are directly involved in criminal acts, and anything done in the occupied territories is a criminal act. And that I think is a good program. There are places in one college in the United States, Hampton College, which was in fact the first college back in 1977 to have initiated a South Africa boycott. They just called for, developed a proposal of pretty much this kind, saying Hampshire should divest from U.S. corporations that are involved in any fashion in actions in the occupied territories, meaning criminal actions, almost by definition, so military, Caterpillar, others. And I think something within that framework is meaningful, plausible, and very justifiable. Now, it's worth remembering that BDS is not a principle, it's a tactic. And the question is it a good tactic? Well, some things that you have to evaluate in terms of its consequences. And it's a good tactic if it serves an educational purpose, gets people to understand things, and leads to further action, which can be beneficial. Now, the problem with a very broad BDS proposal is that given its fundamental hypocrisy, omitting the U.S., and Britain, which also supplies military goods to Israel, it's not an educational, it doesn't serve the educational function. It misleads people. It makes them think that the problem is Israel, which it is, but it's also the U.S., Britain, and others who support it. Let's say Germany, which just provided, a couple of years ago, provided submarines, I think nuclear-powered submarines too, I'm not sure of that, to Israel, which allow it to patrol very broadly near Iran. And if Israel attacks Iran, which conceivably it might, it'll probably be using, that's what they're for, Israel's not defending itself from anyone. So it's pretty broad if you're serious about it. And if you want to have a real educational program that'll get people to understand what's going on in the world, including what their own countries are doing, which is always the most critical thing, because that's the thing you can influence. It's just got to be properly framed. And it easily causes a backlash. In fact, very often, broad BDS proposals have just strengthened jingoist elements who can point to the fact that, the element of hypocrisy in them, and say, well, it's just anti-Semitism. We got to support Israel even more strongly. That's happened over and over. So when you implement a tactic, you have to think of its consequences. Now here, the South African analogy is often brought up, but that's worth thinking through. In South Africa, in the case of South Africa, there was finally a boycott, which was effective, but it was in the 80s, the 1980s. There had been an academic boycott, but it was extremely narrow. It was because of racist hiring. Okay, that makes sense. You can boycott a university for racist hiring practices. But it wasn't general. It wasn't about apartheid. It began late 70s, early 80s. But by the time the South African boycott took off, that was after decades of organizing and educating, educational efforts, which had led to a stage where the population strongly accepted it. In fact, U.S. Congress was passing resolutions of a similar sort. President Reagan had to evade them in order to support apartheid South Africa, but he was evading congressional resolutions. Corporations were basically supporting it. They were supporting what was called the Sullivan principle. You can't have discrimination in hiring. And there was, mayors of cities were getting arrested for protests and so on. Now, that's totally different from the situation here. That level of education and organizing has barely even begun, let alone been achieved. So if that's an analogy at all, what the analogy says is we got a lot of work to do before these proposals really become meaningful.
Norman Finkelstein has said that the public reaction to Jimmy Carter's book, Peace Not Apartheid, was quite positive, the public reaction to it. And
the public reaction to... I didn't quite understand. The public reaction to what?
Public reaction to Jimmy Carter's book was quite positive, and he said that he feels that this reflects a kind of broadening awareness in the American public about the conflict. Do you agree with this, and what do you think this kind of broadening consciousness means for the sort of future?
Well, actually, he's got a lot of experience and a lot of insight. He travels around the country a lot, gives a lot of talks, and can see things changing. And I do too. It's been very clear. The reaction to Carter's book was instructive. He's right. It had kind of a popular resonance. In fact, it was a bestseller. On the other hand, it was utterly lambasted in the mainstream.
Yeah, we have a quote actually from Alan Dershowitz, who said that there is a special place in hell reserved for Jimmy Carter. Just to give an instance.
Alan Dershowitz is not, citing Alan Dershowitz is like citing some ultra-Stalinist Stalin period. It's just meaningless.
Right,
so, for example, Dershowitz, one of his latest gems is during the Gaza war, he wrote an article in the Miami Herald in which he said, this is the purest example of a war between pure magnificence and pure evil through the 20th century. So, like more than the war against the Nazis. I mean, he's kind of off the wall. There's no point discussing it. But although it's kind of interesting that it's tolerated in the United States, which tells you something about the intellectual climate. If anybody said that of any other topic, they'd be utterly ridiculed. In Europe, they'd probably be thrown in jail for hate speech or something. But the point is right. I mean, the intellectual community did condemn the book pretty harshly. There's very little praise for it. But the population is what Norman Finkelstein said. It tended to support it. The reaction is quite interesting. I mean, Carter's book was pretty conventional, actually, for anybody who's familiar with conflict. But in the American intellectual community, it's like a bombshell because you're not allowed to say those things. There was one novel part of the book, important novel part. I mentioned that Israel had rejected the roadmap instantly. It had issued 14 reservations, which essentially eliminated its content. That was suppressed here. In fact, Carter's book was the first time anywhere near the mainstream that it was mentioned, and mentioned prominently. He had an appendix in which he listed the reservations. I didn't see a single commentator even refer to that, the one novelty. There was a tremendous effort by Dershowitz and even sane people to try to find errors in the book. So, did he get a footnote wrong or something? Well, in fact, there was one glaring error in the book which nobody mentioned. He accepted the standard propaganda line that when Israel invaded Lebanon in 1982, it's its most extreme crime to date, killing 20,000 people, it did it in defense against Palestinian rocketing of the Galilee. Okay, that's the party line. It's flatly false. In fact, Israel was bombing Lebanon, trying to elicit a response, and failed, and finally invaded. And the invasion was pretty openly described in Israel as a war to ensure Israeli control of the West Bank, and nothing to do with rockets. But that is the party line, repeated over and over. Thomas Friedman, everybody writes about it, and Carter repeated it. Well, that's the one glaring error, but of course that wasn't mentioned. Going back to Finkelstein's main point, there's a striking shift in attitudes. I mean, I can just tell you from personal experience, like say 10 or 15 years ago, even right here at my own university, if I were to try to talk about these topics, I have to have police protection. Meetings would be broken up, screaming, hysteria, and so on. Same around the country. That's all gone. So give a talk now, hundreds of people show up, engaged, enthusiastic, can't even get a critical question. And that's true all over the country. And polls have shown that in the Jewish population, there's a kind of a generation split developing. Among younger Jews, they're finding it harder and harder to tolerate Israel's extreme violations of their generally liberal attitudes on things. So they're kind of drifting away or becoming quite critical. During the Gaza war, Congress and the press enthusiastically supported it, almost unanimously. Maybe they said it was disproportionate, just about the harshest criticism you could get, but not the bloggers, especially the young ones. They were very critical and very sharp, and that again reflects the same split. Now, in the United States, public opinion has very little influence on policy. It's a formally democratic country, but there's a sharp split between public opinion and policy on a great many issues. And in fact, for a long time, the public has been in favor of the international consensus. So the Arab League plan was pretty strongly supported by the public, but rejected by the government. And it's an open question whether this change in attitudes that's very perceptible will influence policy. It's important to bear in mind that the media and the general intellectual culture typically stay very close to the government position, the kind of state corporate party line, if you want to call it that. Maybe a little deviation around the fringes, but not very much. The public is different. And here we reach the deep question of a serious democratic deficit. Public opinion is essentially ignored, not just on this topic, on topic after topic, including things very crucial to the public, domestic issues too.
In Britain, we have a section of our newsprint which defines itself as populist. These papers are usually aimed at the working class, such as The Sun, but seem to espouse and present opinions and create belief systems that are counterproductive to the interests of their main readership. With such control of the informational environment of this section of the population, how can they break free from the influences that their social circumstances affords them?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. You probably know better than I do, but if you go back not many years to the 1960s, these tabloids were left-wing papers. Their change reflects a change in Britain. Similar things happened in the U.S. The New York Post, which is a tabloid and is now maybe kind of so far to the right, you need a telescope to find it. When I was a kid, it was a kind of a leftish social democratic paper. In fact, in England, the most widely read newspaper until the early 1960s was the Daily Herald, which was working class based social democrat. I think it had a broader circulation than most of the major newspapers combined. So it was a popular, kind of slightly leftish newspaper, a lot of reader support and so on, and it made a difference. It went out of business, I think, in the mid-60s because it couldn't compete with capital concentration and advertiser reliance. What has pretty much destroyed the free press. There used to be a very lively free press in England and the United States in the 19th century, probably its peak, and it kind of declined since. And it's largely an effect of capital concentration and advertiser reliance, which an independent press isn't going to be able to compete with. So yes, there's been a change, and your question is quite appropriate. How do you reach people when the press is imposing on them a doctrinal system which is contrary to their interests and concerns? And that's a question which hasn't been investigated much, unfortunately, and it's an interesting one, but it does show up in strange ways. Now, I don't know about England, but in the United States, there's very intensive study of popular attitudes. That's primarily because it's a business-run society, and business wants to keep its finger on public pulse. That's how you know how to control people and so on. So we have a ton of information about U.S. attitudes. Now, the press is divided between, kind of like Fox News, sort of like the Sun, which is
owned by the same corporation, actually.
Yeah, I think so. It's, jingoist, extremist, racist, everything else. And that reaches a mass audience. On the other hand, you have what's called the liberal press, aimed at liberal intellectuals, New York Times, Washington Post, Boston Globe, and so on. But they give a totally distorted picture of what's happening. Like on this issue, everything I was just saying before would be unknown to readers of the mainstream liberal press, because it's all suppressed. As I said, they rarely deviate much from a kind of a party line. They can give criticisms on the fringe, but not fundamental criticisms. Like take, say, the Iraq War. Obama is hailed by the liberal intellectual establishment for having taken a principled stand against the war from the beginning. Well, he did take a principled stand by the standards of the intellectual community. Namely, he took approximately the stand that the Nazi generals took after Stalingrad, when they said a two-front war is a strategic error, shouldn't have done it. Well, that's what Obama said. He said the invasion of Iraq is a strategic blunder. You could read that in Pravda in the early 1980s, critics of the Russian invasion of Afghanistan. We don't call that a principled stand in the case of others. We call it the pure cynicism. But in our own case, that's a principled stand, because that's as far as you're allowed to go. You can't say, it's a war crime. I mean, the same thing came up with the torture memos recently. There were a couple of new things in them, which were incidentally mostly suppressed by the press. About the only new thing that came out of any interest was that Cheney, Wolfowitz, and the rest Rumsfeld, were pressing very hard for U.S. intelligence to elicit confessions that would link Iraq to al-Qaeda. They couldn't get the evidence, and the interrogators said, look, there isn't any evidence, we can't do it. And that's where the torture comes from. So they were demanding that they torture in order to get the evidence that the government needed in order to invade Iraq. Well, that's about the only interesting thing in the whole, in all the revelations. It was never reported in the New York Times or the Washington Post. It was reported in the McClatchy press, a smaller but quite good news press. And then comes the surprise. You read the liberal commentators, in fact, the strongest opponents of Bush, really critical ones, and very good ones, like Paul Krugman or Jane Mayer, who did some of the main exposure of the Guantanamo torture. And their reaction to it is, we've lost our way. Look what this Bush administration did to us. We always were a noble, idealistic country, and look what they've done. Really? When we were a noble, idealistic country, like when the English colonists came over, and we were a city on the hill. That's what's the usual phrase. But take a look at that phrase. The U.S. colonies were declared a city on the hill by John Winthrop, the English colonist, in 1630. We're going to be a city on the hill. A year before that, 1629, his colony, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, put out what's called the Great Seal of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. You can find it on the internet.
Native American fellow with something out of his mouth, we need your help, or something like that, wasn't it?
Yeah, it said, come. It was an Indian pleading, come over and help us. Yeah. That's the first example of what's now called humanitarian intervention, very much loved by the British intellectual classes. Right. And it's a pretty typical example. So the John Winthrop city on the hill was perfectly benign. In fact, they were just answering the plea of these miserable pagans to come over and help them. Well, they came over and helped them. They even helped them get to heaven pretty quickly because they exterminated them, So that's the city on the hill from the beginning. And it just continues. There's no point running through the history. But somehow the torture memos show we've lost our way. Now, it's true that in the last 50 years or so, there's been a shift. The CIA in the early 50s did begin to develop new techniques of torture based on the KGB and the Gestapo, who had discovered that the most efficient means of torture are essentially psychological, kind that don't leave marks on the body, but that turn people into vegetables, like sensory deprivation. Actually, what you saw in Abu Ghraib, that's mostly mental torture, it's called. What is not reported in the press is that when the U.S. signed the Torture Convention, first, Reagan signed it, Clinton had it ratified, it excluded CIA torture. So it modified the International Torture Convention to drop the references to mental torture. That is exactly the kind we do, usually done by clients, like Saigon Army or the Salvadoran torturers or something like that. So basically, the U.S., you could argue that the Bush administration isn't violating the Torture Convention as the U.S. interpreted it. It's a little different from its predecessors in that so much was done by U.S. armed personnel. Usually torture is farmed out to clients. So a little different, and almost all of it is still carried out by clients. As far as we know, the Obama administration is continuing that. Renditions going on. The Obama administration has tried to reinstitute Bush programs that were banned by the courts. So the courts did say that prisoners have the right of habeas corpus, civil rights, a lawyer and so on. The Obama Justice Department is trying to overrule it. So not for Guantanamo, which they want to get rid of, it's an embarrassment, but for Bagram and other black sites, wherever they are, which are much more serious. They want to make sure that prisoners held there have no rights. And also in other respects, they're trying to reinstitute essentially the Bush programs, slightly different guise. So why the surprise about the torture memos? And in the background is the fact that even the torture is not a great crime in comparison with the invasions. There are far worse crimes, not torture, but that's inexpressible. So to get back to your question, what does the population do when it's faced with an overwhelming barrage of self-justification, support for our nobility, our angelic character, maybe defamed by a couple of bad apples and so on. But that's a question that arises in every powerful state in England, for example. I mean, in England, how many people read John Stuart Mill's classic essay on humanitarian intervention? You should. It's he's a great figure, one of the enlightened figures. Now, this came out in 1859, right after the vicious, brutal British repression of the Indian Rebellion, which was well known. In fact, Parliament was denouncing it and so on. So Mill knew all about it, of course, aside from the fact that he was an official of the East Asia Society, so he knew everything that was going on. His essay on humanitarian intervention should be read in every elementary school, but certainly every college. He starts by saying that we have to be really careful about humanitarian intervention. Usually it's dubious, but he says it's a different thing for England, because England is different from other states in the world. England is an angelic power. It is so magnificent that the Europeans can't understand us. They keep imputing base motives to us when we're doing things out of pure generosity and goodwill, as we've always done. And he goes on with this, way beyond Bush and Cheney, and then he says, well, we take India, which is his main concern. He says it's the city on the hill again. He says we have to expand our conquest of India for the benefit of the barbarians. It's that scroll coming out of their mouths again saying, come over and help us. So we've got to continue to devastate and destroy India right after the massacres and the Indian Mutiny, because they're pleading with us to do it. And we should do it even though others will cast obloquia on us because they don't understand our magnificence. They can't believe it with their backward belief systems. And he knew perfectly well that the point of expanding British control over India at that point was to try to gain a monopoly over opium. The British were running the biggest narco-trafficking enterprise in history, way beyond anything else, and they wanted to gain a monopoly of opium so that they could smash their way by gunboats into the China market. China didn't want British goods. They thought their own goods were better, and the British couldn't handle that, so had to turn them into a nation of drug addicts and then force British goods on them. It was called free trade in those days. That's what the purpose of the angelic power expanding its conquest of India was. Well, if these things aren't at the center of the curriculum, people in England don't understand their own history. Of course, this is not the only example. It's just a striking one and an important one because of the hysteria about humanitarian intervention these days, which usually turns out about the way it did on the city on the hill. How do people get to understand themselves, their own country, their own history? It's not easy. There are serious ideological barriers to it. There are people who break through them, but it's a big task. It's essentially the task of civilizing the country. And it can be done. In fact, as I said, you see it even in the United States, where there's very little dissidence anywhere near the mainstream. Nevertheless, the population has, on a lot of issues, attitudes that, at least by my standards, are pretty sane, much more so than public policy. So, yeah, it can be done, but it doesn't happen easily.
I think we've got time for 2 more questions, hopefully. We could keep the answers just as brief as is possible.
Okay.
Many protesters seem to be more and more these days being labelled as anarchists, but obviously by the current understanding of what that word means, not its actual definition. By, it seems, a media who seek to kind of stereotype them with the modern conception of what this word means and sort of marginalise them. Can you explain how the term anarchist became a derogatory term? And do you feel protesters who accept this stereotype and act accordingly sort of undermine their own legitimate act of protest?
Well, anarchists come over a wide range, but back to the 19th century, at the origins of the more or less organized anarchist movements, They were bitterly defamed as, terrorists, murderers, killers, anarchism is chaos, and so on and so forth. And that's not the core history of anarchism. Anarchism it grows straight out of the Enlightenment. It's, in fact, the leading anarchist historians like Rudolf Rocker, I think correctly pointed out he was talking about the anarcho-syndicalist tradition as just the extension of classical liberalism, which foundered on the rocks of capitalism. So you take liberal ideals, 18th century ideals, that's pre-capitalist basically. And when capitalism developed, they couldn't, it was essentially distorted or destroyed, and anarchism expands and continues that tradition. Now, anarchism is not just opposition to the state, it's opposition to illegitimate authority. That means corporations, it means businesses, it means the state insofar as it's illegitimate and so on. And naturally, opposition to illegitimate authority is going to be bitterly condemned by illegitimate authority. That's a big surprise. So yeah, it gets defamed, vilified, and you can find incidents which justify the vilification. But I think what we should do is just ignore the vilification, understand where it's coming from, and develop what's sound in the tradition, which I think is its core. I mean, the core of the tradition, at least as I understand it, is that any form of authority or hierarchy or domination, whether it's in the family, in international affairs, anywhere else, has to justify itself. It's not self-justifying. It carries a burden of proof. Got to show that you're justified. And if that burden of proof can't be met, which is almost always, then you should move to dismantle it. As far as I understand, that's the core principle of anarchism, and it does have clear Enlightenment roots, and I think one should be proud to be part of that tradition.
Could you also quickly comment about the students who carry on this stereotype? Because I'm not sure about America, but certainly in England we have activists who carry on this violent theme, and does that legitimize, or is it illegitimate? Does it threaten legitimate protest?
It can. Same in the United States, always. And back in the 1960s, when student activism really took off in the modern world, in the United States, which was sort of the core of it, it was going in several directions. The Students for Democratic, which was a big student organization in the 60s, which was at the forefront of a lot of civil rights protests, anti-war protests, and so on. By 1968 and 69, it was splitting. In fact, it split and was destroyed, and it split into two wings. One of them became Maoist. We'll stand out in front of General Motors factories and hand out leaflets to the workers saying, let's have a popular revolution, you follow us. That's one wing. And the other wing was Weathermen. Let's break windows and smash things up and bomb and so on. Well, those were both very negative developments, and it did undermine the student movement. Not entirely. There was a strain that continued and expanded and had a big effect in civilizing the society. But those are problems that are always going to be faced. Students happen to be at a period in their lives when they're the freest they're ever going to be. They're out of parental supervision, more or less, and they don't yet have the responsibilities of trying to survive in a difficult world, put food on the table for your children, that sort of thing. So they have a period of freedom. That's a period of which you can explore and you can try things out, you can think things, but it has to be done responsibly, and that's not so simple, even for neurological reasons. It's by now pretty well known that the male brain reaches maturation pretty late, probably in the mid-20s. So like male teenagers can be extremely irresponsible because they're basically children. They're grown up, but cognitively children. In fact, in some countries, the justice system is even getting to be modified for this. Women, it's earlier. It's like around 18 or so. But and there are probably evolutionary reasons for it. Like back in hunter-gatherer times, the population probably had to have some category of people who were willing to go out and face raging lions or without any fear or concern or something. Okay, that's young males. But these are non-trivial questions. I mean, you have to do these things think them through, do them with a sense of responsibility, ask what the consequences are. Tactics are very significant. They're not marginal. That's what has human significance, human implications, what your tactics are. So you have to think them through, see if they're conducive to the ends you're trying to achieve, and try to formulate the ends carefully. And there's plenty of ways to go wrong. I don't regard myself as a master tactician. I've been wrong plenty of times. But you have to really think about it. And the student movements do have great potential. In fact, they had a big effect in civilizing the United States and the Western world. It's very different from what it was in the 60s. Very substantially student initiative. On the other hand, there are byways that can undermine what you're trying to achieve. And you have to be cautious about that.
I don't know if we have time to we'd like to ask you a question about the linguistic situation here at Sussex, but it's obviously very short. Do you want to ask it?
Sussex University is closing the linguistics department and has a greater plan to introduce a business school. Firstly, what does this say about the direction our university is going in? And secondly, would you support protest camps and other action that has offended the management at our university, and they've threatened students with expulsion and various other fines, things like that? Would you support students in those actions?
Well, I have a special interest in the linguistics department, but it's putting that aside. There is a tendency in the universities, and it's all over the West, to sort of corporatize them, to shift the core of the educational system towards providing assistance to the business world, train people to play their role in the business world. It's not that it makes them more productive. Just take a look at the financial institutions. We don't have to talk about it. It's very destructive, but that's where there's a temptation to go there. The incentive system in the West is set up so that you have an incentive to make extremely risky actions in a big investment bank. And if you win, you're richer than you can imagine. If you lose, the public pays you off, so nothing much happens. And the thing is kind of constructed that way, and yes, you can drive people into that. So nothing productive about it, but it is a drift in the colleges. It's obvious why. That's where their funding comes from. That's how the states are run. That's the concentrations of capital. And it ought to be resisted. I mean, the universities ought to be places of free, independent inquiry, thought, so on, and not only preserve the treasures of civilization, but enhance them, understand more deeply discover the answers to hard questions, like questions about, say, human nature. It's what I think linguistics should be about. And how you balance this is not so simple. I mean, university administration, no matter how good-hearted, is going to have to face the fact that it needs funding. Colleges and universities are parasitic institutions. They depend on outside support somewhere, and they can't pretend they're on Mars. They're in societies with special concentrations of capital and resources which are going to make their demands. And you have to wade your way through this. Now, as far as the tactical decisions as to how to protest it are concerned, I'll have to go back to what I said before. Those decisions have to be made by people on the scene who can evaluate the circumstances and consider the consequences of their actions and the kinds of actions that will be constructive and the kind that will undermine their own cause. And that's a delicate decision. I mean, in my own university, I must say I've often had conflicts with student activists over this, and they've often been right, and I've often been wrong. But it's it's a careful decision, and I don't consider myself any authority on it, even when I know the circumstances. But from outside, you just can't say anything. Don't know enough.
Okay, well, I think we should probably let you go now because Bev told us to make sure you were off at the right time. But thanks very much. We really, really appreciate it. Thank you.
Enjoy.
Okay, bye.
Yep.